Hey, how's it going, everyone? Just want to do a lesson based on Luke chapter 7. Kind of got started thinking about this just based on, um, just lightly searching for jobs and stuff. So, on unemployment, you have to uh, look for jobs or at least show, them that you're searching. So, I've updated some of my LinkedIn, and then I have the issue of like needing references for pretty much every job that's out there. And so it got me thinking of an interaction between Jesus and John the Baptist's disciples, and something that Jesus said. So I'll read Luke 7:18 to 23, and then kind of take it from there. Luke 7:18 reads, "And the disciples of John showed him all these things, and John, calling unto him two of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? When the men were come unto him, they said, John the Baptist has sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that should come, or we look for another?" So this also is a luxury, I would say, that we have, looking back. We have a lot of confusion in the world, people who will even say Jesus didn't exist, which is insane. But we have the luxury of kind of looking back and reading about all the things that are documented about Jesus. And so John is living in the moment, and he is, again, the highest spirit below Jesus Christ, the most exalted amongst men. This is straight from Jesus' mouth. So a very special entity, privy to a lot of things, information, in the spirit world, but he is still like us. He's sort of touching and feeling his way around life, and observing, this entity Jesus, and asked his disciples to go and ask Jesus, if he's the one, the Messiah. And in verse 21, it reads, "And in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues and of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sight." I'm certain there are lots of interactions that were done that could not be documented, and just the volume that Jesus would be doing of healing and teaching and all that stuff cannot be contained, in a book. And there's actual verses that support that statement. And so he was busy, doing the works of the Most High. Verse 22, "Then Jesus answering said unto him, Go your way and tell John that things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached. And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended by me." And that's the verse that stands out to me. That is, I would say, an incredible statement, that first of all, if we think about this, why would anybody be offended by Jesus? Look at his resume that he's talking about, a brief portion of his resume that he is rhyming off in verse 22. He's allowing the blind to see, he's allowing the lame to walk, lepers are being cleansed, the deaf are hearing, the dead are being raised, and to the poor the gospel is preached. And so he is focusing on the marginalized group in society in that time, and would be the same to this day. And those people are needed in place to create a sort of capitalistic structure, and a religious theocracy, which still in many ways exists today. It's just different characters, different religious views, and all that kind of stuff. The hierarchies are still in place, and especially if you believe in reincarnation, it's just in a different generation, and stuff like that. So there were hierarchies in place that were being irritated by Jesus focusing on the lepers, the deaf, the dead, even the poor. And this was problematic, for people in that time. And it would be no different today. If Jesus came and started ministering to these people, even religious people would get offended. They would be like, what are you wasting your time over there for? Like, come to our church, we got a seat for you, we got a spot for you, in a big place and all that. What are you doing with them? They're no one cares about them, and so those people that he was ministering to, one would think, and this is obvious, that he would be doing the same thing if he were here in this day. And so he was irritating the structures that are in place then, and the same to this day. And the problem is, the thing is that it would offend religious people. And this to me is an incredible thing. And I just want people out there don't be offended, by the God of the Bible, because he does things in a way that is completely opposite to the way that we're programmed to be. Definitely in the system that we're in now, and it's been the same when Luke was writing these words, describing the things that he was doing. And this is why he said, "And blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended by me." There are people, even people who have been teaching the Bible for many, many years, that would get offended if they saw that Jesus was using his work amongst the poor as a means of validating the fact that he's from God, not his number of followers, his influence, his eloquent speech, all that kind of stuff. How many people like him and all that. He didn't care about that. And I think that this to me is an amazing thing. This is an entity that is very, very special. And I also want to let people know, just as a preparation, and I have to brace myself for this too. I'm not exempt from this potential letdown, but if there are many poor people who are, quote, raptured or taken away, this shouldn't be offensive, to us. It shouldn't. And I'm genuinely bracing myself for this as well. If these kind of things happen when I'm still here on earth, that this is not for us to be offended by that, because this is the very heart of God. And I know that most people, and even myself in many ways throughout my life, even somebody who sort of actively preaches these things in different ways throughout my life, it is still somewhat offensive to me, that God truly cares about the poor. And he literally says here, to the poor, the gospel is preached. And even though I'm teaching it, it still takes some time for me to realize that this is literal. This is the case, that he's not just joking, saying that he cares about poor people. God genuinely has his heart and his eyes fixed on the poor. And to me, that is reaffirmed everywhere, not just here. And we're not to be offended by that, And in fact, people, and I would say in these days, it's much easier to take these literally, again, because of flat earth, and now knowing that the Bible is true, or very, very likely to be true. It just has a few things to still be made manifest. It's God's judgments. But this should not be offensive to us. In fact, we should rejoice knowing that this is true, that this is the way God is, that he actually will go after the, quote, lowest in the hierarchy, and that will create a heaven. If there was a God that started at the top and then trickled down, this satanic concept of trickle down economics, if the God of the Bible was like that, there would be just more of this in heaven. But if we have a God, Jesus Christ, who actually ministers to the poor and tries to uplift them and build them up, then we can have heaven established, if that is the entity that is in charge of the kingdom. And thank God that he is and will be, because he is starting with the, quote, lowest. And they're the one that need him, fundamentally. Everybody else, all of us, to some extent or another, find ways to be independent of God, and not have to rely on him. And I think that there's more and more reason to, lean on God, for everything. And I'm speaking to myself that, those moments in our life, however they come, that require us to lean on God, is a blessing. And this is an amazing thing. And I think that's explicitly stated here in Luke, of God's, heart and mindset on the poor. Another great example is I want to also read in Luke 16:19. There was a certain rich man which was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. And there was a certain beggar named Lazarus which was laid at his gate, full of sores, and desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. I want people to take a moment and visualize this, because if the Bible is true, again, big if the Bible is true, but we have a lot of reasons to believe in it in this day. Picture this sight. Picture this beggar named Lazarus, who is laid at the gate full of sores. He's in a situation that is probably even worse, and I'm not saying this to trivialize the struggles of the homeless here in Houston downtown, but he would visually be worse than some of them. The dogs would come and lick his face. And we would look at it at anything like that and just be like, that person is disgusting. We would say that as humans. And the Bible has a very, very different outcome, for this entity, Lazarus, this spirit, this human. And it came to pass that the beggar died and was carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom, and the rich man also died and was buried. It's not a mistake that Lazarus was, carried away in an angelic way, and they just describe the rich man as being dead. And Jesus even says to his own disciple, let the dead bury the dead, when they wanted to go to a funeral. He's like, let the dead bury the dead. So that's just flesh and bones. And then to me, this is where it gets allegorical. In verse 23, and he lifted up his eyes, being in torment, this is the rich man, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. So first of all, he has eyes. So this is just, to me, allegorical. There's no eyes in the spirit world, our human eyes. But again, whether it's allegorical or literal, it's not that important to this. But just know that I want people to visualize this beggar, and he is described as somebody who is just looking for the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table, and the dogs were licking his sores and looking after him. And this is an incredible thing, and this would never be believed by a majority of religious people on earth. I don't care what religious background you are. This would be insane, but I just want people to brace themselves that, again, if the God of the Bible is true, then we have reason to trust these words and these stories, that they're not just for effect, that this is actually the way that God is, that and that this entity, Lazarus, is being comforted by Abraham, and think about all the different scenarios and situations of the people on earth that fit this situation and fit the rich man, which could potentially be us, and then Lazarus. There's Lazaruses everywhere. There's Lazaruses just a few blocks away from me downtown. So, and it's the number is increasing, and we all can, if we're not actually financially rich, we can all have this mindset of the rich man. And I don't want people to make simple mistakes, when it comes to the Bible. And I'm pointing to myself that this is the heart of God. And so if there are a lot of, and I have a feeling this is just, to me, also one way that I reconcile all this confusion when it comes to the doctrine for all of us, really, that a lot of poor people will be taken away. If this rapture happens in our lifetime, this quote story is going to be literal, that the Lazaruses will be taken away, here it literally says by angels, and it would be no different in the end times. And so, all of us fighting, and I'm a part of the problem sometimes, but all of us fighting for who's right and who's closest to God and all that kind of stuff, God is going to show us where his heart and mind really is. And this is also supported in 1 Corinthians 1:27, but God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And so this people think is a joke, and we've been taught, brainwashed, to think that this is a joke. But I think that a lot of us, me included, are going to be in for a rude awakening when we find out who God actually cares about. And the reason fundamentally why God would have an affinity for the poor is they're the ones that only need him. All of us, we have some reason or another to be offended by God. The poor, anybody who is blind or lame or a leper or deaf or poor, they're not offended by God. They need God. That's their last hope, really. And I would say it's wise for anybody who has an ear to hear that we have to put ourselves in that sort of desperation. And then Jesus says in verse 23, blessed is he whoever shall not be offended by me. So there's a risk, and there's a vibe out there, really, on earth, is to make up our own God. And all I can do is warn people through my channel that if you make up your own God, you're running the risk of that God not answering. And so everybody ultimately is going to worship the God that they have made up in their head, whatever that is. No one can not have a God. Everybody ultimately reports, quote unquote, reports to something else or someone else. And that's going to be uncovered, whether we like it or not. And I would just say for people, just be careful, because we have to know this, because it's written in a lot of places, that God has his heart and mind set on the poor. Also, so for my channel, basically, for anybody who will find any kind of comfort, in my channel, it's not a question of does God exist or anything like that. I would just use flat earth to prove that. The question now is, learning about Jesus, and then those moments where we don't feel like he's around, we're allowed to freely question, where is God? And I would say people in those camps who at least acknowledge that Jesus existed, and you can have a place at the table. And then also those who are skeptical, wondering, where is God, in all of this, that's fair enough. That anybody like that will find some amount of usefulness, in my channel. But other than that, it's just a waste of time, because me personally, I've just moved past that kind of thinking, that Jesus doesn't exist, or atheists and all that kind of stuff. Like, we can deal with an atheist quickly, but you're not going to have too much airtime. And even in 2 Peter verse 4, it's prophesied that this will be the case, and I don't think this is always evil. It said, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. So it's natural that we all, even people of faith, that we say those things, because we just think that will just keep continuing. And I think that there's a way to have that questioning be evil if it's saying in like mocking God, but it's also, to me, also virtuous to genuinely look around and be like, where is God, in all of this? And I also want to end off with Matthew 32:33, and this is a prophecy, but also a promise, that Jesus makes. Whosoever shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever shall deny me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. I just want people to think about this, and just think about the things of this world and what potentially we all could be clinging to that would cause us to deny God, And so I would just, as a friendly but still stern warning for anybody out there, even if they've been in religion and Christianity, don't make up your own God. It's a bad idea. Just, I would say, and I think Flat Earth for me has given me incredible insight to allow me to read the Bible as it's literally true, in many places where it's appropriate to be literal. And it's very, very obvious that God literally cares about the poor, even if, like I read in 2 Peter, it seems like God doesn't care. It's like, where's the promises of his coming? There's poor people everywhere. Truth is just, half-baked truth, half-truths at best. There's lies everywhere. There's fake everything on the news. It's just a complete joke. But I want people to have some comfort that we're allowed to say, where is the promise of his coming? But also know that this was also prophesied. So it has to happen first. And, it's not wrong to have those sort of murmurings amongst ourselves, but ultimately we all should have faith in this entity, Jesus Christ, who ministers to the poor. I know it's outlandish in the world that we live in that anybody would care about the poor, even God. It's outlandish to believe that, because no one cares about the poor. No one even talks about the poor. The poor is just, it's just a joke or whatever. Like, there's they're all on drugs, like they're all crazy, it's their fault and all that kind of stuff. There's just every reason for us, all of us, and I'm putting myself in that collective group, that we have a reason to believe that God also doesn't care about them. And I would say that all of us, I have a feeling, are going to be in for a rude awakening, and so anybody who thinks like, if this rapture happens, that like, these leaders in the flat earth and all these quote unquote truthers, and even myself, we're not we're not the people, and I say this as humbly as I can, we're not the people that God is focusing on. As much as we may think that some of this preaching and all this quote work, is something that God values, and I'm not saying he completely devalues it, but God cares about the Spirit, and his Spirit is said to literally be in the poor, that God literally hides himself in the poor. And again, modern day Christianity, which is completely satanic, will not teach that, and certainly not say that that's literally true, when we have many, many examples in the Bible that state that that is literally the case. If we were to look at someone like Lazarus right now on the street, any preacher, I'm talking 10 out of 10 preachers, would walk to them and feel like they're ministering to a spirit below them. But the sad reality for a lot of people, and I don't want this to fall upon anybody unnecessarily, is those spirits that are in some of these poor are highly exalted, and so if you believe in reincarnation, it helps us understand why that is the case, that this is their final pruning before they are comforted, by the Father Abraham. And so I just, implore people to read the Bible in a different way. We've been programmed to believe all this capitalistic mantra, this seek pleasure, and any little thing that we can do to help the poor. God is, somehow thinking that that puts us in a higher position than the poor, and that is not the case. That is absolutely not the case. In order to access Jesus literally when he was physically here on earth, a person would have to go into an uncomfortable situation, in places. He's not at the country clubs all the time. He obviously had friends in those groups because people were drawn to him. And so he's not going to tell people to F off, like he is going to do his work. But his focus and his ministry is literally said here in Luke 7:22, amongst the blind, amongst the lame, amongst the lepers, amongst the deaf and the poor. And so that's where he would be. And it would be no different now. And then not just him doing that, we'd have to then infer, why is he drawn to those type of people? Like they're not going to be able to then go and spread his fame. These are people who are, some of them who are blind, so they've never seen anything. They don't even actually know that it was him that did it. So they're not going to be able to go and, get him 500 extra subs on YouTube, or 1,000 subs, or give him super chats. We're talking about the lepers, the deaf, even the dead, and the poor. The gospel is preached. So we have to understand, all of us, and I'm preaching to myself here, is that the God of the Bible is almost completely, and in many ways, in almost everything that we know in this world, completely diametrically opposed to the thinking. The thinking that's here on this earth is completely satanic. A majority of people on this earth are completely brain dead. They are totally spiritually blind, and they actually think that things that we have and pleasures that we have experienced will be able to be cashed in for something meaningful, and in fact they're going to be held against us in most cases. So just I would recommend people read the Bible very, very differently, and understand that God's heart and mind is with the poor, even if they're increasing in number, and it seems like they're not being cared for. That certainly will not go on forever. Hope everyone's doing well. Bye.